So do you guys remember a few weeks ago I got really heated because you voted for the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 as a better PlayStation console than the PS1? I was like, what the hell is wrong with you guys? There's something seriously wrong with my subscribers. I couldn't believe those results, but this other poll that I did isn't much better. It might actually be worse. So I also asked you guys what is the best Nintendo handheld, and I gave you guys 5 options: the Game Boy Advance, the DS, the 3DS, and the Switch. The Switch has almost 50% of the entire vote. The original Game Boy, the handheld that literally started everything, the reason why we have handhelds to begin with, only got a meager 4%. That alone is a travesty that the original Game Boy got the least amount of votes of all the Nintendo handhelds. That's disgusting. But the fact that the Nintendo Switch, which is actually the worst handheld that Nintendo has ever made, got almost 50% of the entire vote, there's something wrong here. Emperor Gaozu thinks that these people are too young to even know about the Game Boy, so they picked the Switch. I hope that's true, but that would mean that all of my viewers are like 12, 13 years old, because even the 3DS was a better handheld than the Switch in almost every way imaginable. So we're going to get into why the Switch is Nintendo's worst handheld. And when I say worst, I don't necessarily mean that the Switch is bad, but when you compare it to all the other handhelds Nintendo's ever made, it has to be at the bottom of the list. Kind of like the PlayStation 4 compared to the other PlayStations. The PS4 is just not on the same level as the PS1, 2, and 3. Same thing goes for the Switch and the other handhelds. And when I say handhelds, that's another thing that needs to be distinguished, because the Switch is obviously it's a hybrid. It's half a handheld, half a console. The reason why I did this poll was judging the Switch just as a handheld. So even though it's a good system overall, I mean, the whole idea of being able to switch between playing on your TV and playing on the go is a neat concept. But when we're just looking at the Switch as a handheld, as a follow-up to the 3DS, it's a big disappointment. And Summonon really sums up the way I feel about the Switch. He says that the Switch, it seems nice, but it has too low of a battery life and doesn't fit in most pockets. He went with the original Game Boy as the best Nintendo handheld because it had by far the best game library for its age and stood the test of time as one of the best systems of all time. But the Game Boy Advance and DS are close second. The 3DS is good, but not in that level. Yeah, I totally agree. I think the original Game Boy, I'm not going to say that it's the best one. I'm actually going to get into that in a separate video about what I think the best Nintendo handheld is. We're going to focus on the worst one, and it has to be the Switch. Because, like Summonon pointed out, it has a worse battery life than the 3DS, which is ridiculous considering how fucking big it is, which is the other problem that the Switch has. It's just not portable. It's supposed to be a handheld, but you can't reasonably take it everywhere you go because it doesn't fit in your fucking pocket. So what's the point? Okay, you're going to carry around a knapsack or a backpack with you. I didn't have to do that with the 3DS. I didn't have to do that with the DS or any other Nintendo handheld. But with the Switch, you can't have that shit in your pocket, so you have to have a knapsack or a backpack or something to carry it with you. And I have a serious problem with that, because if it's a pain in the ass to carry it around, I might as well just stick with a home console and not a Nintendo Switch. Even the Switch Lite, which is a smaller version of the Switch, you can't even fit that in your pocket. Barely. I mean, if you have, like, really thick jean pockets, you might be able to, but, like, just a regular pair of shorts, good luck having that shit in your pocket like a cell phone. It's not... It's just such a pain in the ass to carry it around. I remember back in the day, everybody would be carrying around a DS in their pocket. They'd have a 3DS even. I saw a lot of that, especially back in high school. And the thing is, I have a lot of friends that own a Switch, but when we go out, they never actually have it with them because, again, it's not actually convenient to carry around with you and take it on the go. So those are the two main reasons why the Switch is automatically the worst handheld Nintendo's ever made, because it's not very portable. I know people like the whole concept of the Switch being a hybrid that, yeah, you could take it on the go, but you could also plug it into a TV. But me personally, I'd rather them just focus entirely on their handhelds, because that's what Nintendo does best. Even the 3DS was a big success, as the Wii U was failing badly. I would rather them, if people really want to do the whole plug-in TV thing, if they make a Switch 2, don't even call it the Switch. Have it be a dedicated handheld that if you want to plug it in, you can buy an add-on or adapter or something that allows you to dock it or, like, put an HDMI cable in or something. Like, I think that would be the best way for them to go about it in the future, because the Switch, just isn't that interesting to me personally. I know it has a great game library, but it's not... First of all, the game library is not on the same level as the other handheld, so that's another thing. I don't even think the Switch's game library is on par with previous handhelds, and that includes the 3DS. Even, like, the big Pokemon game is a good example. It's a downgrade from the 3DS version, because you don't have the national dex. So it's like, the games are not even getting that much better. I think Mario Odyssey and Breath of the Wild are, the two really standout games on the Switch. Mario Kart 8 is a Wii U remaster, but the third-party support that you see on the Switch, it's all ports of games that were on the PS4 and Xbox One that run like shit. I know, like, but you can play Doom on the go, you can play Overwatch on the go, but they barely run at 30 FPS and they look like shit and play like shit. So I'd rather play the PC version, never mind the console version, but you know what I'm trying to say. Like, when the whole premise of the Switch's third-party support is that you can play games you already own on the go, it's not that enticing to me, because at least the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo DS, even the Nintendo 3DS, they had games that were tailor-made for that platform, rather than just being ports of other games on other systems. I mean, you had a few of them, like the Game Boy Advance had plenty of Super Nintendo ports, and the 3DS had a lot of 3D ports from other systems, like you had Star Fox 64 3D, I think you also had Ocarina of Time 3D, Street Fighter 4 3D, but you also had a lot of other games that were tailor-made for the 3DS. Like the Monster Hunter games on 3DS were fucking phenomenal. You also had Phoenix Wright, which is also on the Switch, but they're remastered games that were already on the original DS, so that doesn't really count. But the point I'm trying to make is that the 3DS and the previous Nintendo handhelds, when we're talking about third-party support, you had so much more than just inferior ports from other consoles and remasters, because that's the bulk of the Switch's library. It's games that were also multi-platform but run significantly worse on the Switch, because the Switch is kind of like in between the PS3 and PS4 in terms of power and performance. Obviously, they had to make a lot of compromises to get a handheld but also a home console, so it was really big for a handheld, but it also was kind of underpowered for a home console, so it kind of failed in both ways in that respect. Even though the Switch had a fantastic first-party library and still continues to build upon that, I just don't think the Switch can even be in the conversation as one of the best handhelds that Nintendo's ever made. It's clearly the worst. Like, yeah, the Game Boy Advance and DS were incredibly underpowered for their time, even compared to the competition, which was the PSP. But I think what made those two platforms special is that you had games that were made specifically for that hardware in mind, because you can't port PS2 games onto the Game Boy Advance or the DS, obviously. So when he did have those multi-platform releases, they weren't even close to being the same game. They were games that were made specifically to take advantage of the 32-bit hardware of the Game Boy Advance and also the DS later on, a few years later. It just feels like with the Switch, a lot of the game library is just recycled crap that we've already played before, whether it's remasters of Wii U games, or now we're talking about Wii games like Skyward Sword, or multi-platform releases that come out years after it came out on the other systems. Like Overwatch didn't come out on Switch until a couple of years after the Switch was out. So at that point, if you want to play Overwatch, you probably played it already, and you played it on more powerful and better hardware. So even though there are a lot of great first-party games on the Switch, I just don't think the library overall holds up to the other handhelds. But I would also argue that the Switch overall isn't a very good value proposition. They're charging $300, which never came down in price over the years, by the way, which sounds okay, it's not a big deal, because for $300 you get so much out of it. But do you really? I have never met a single Switch owner that hasn't put a lot more than $300 into just getting it started. We're not talking about games, because obviously you have to buy games in order to actually enjoy your gaming system. That's obviously a thing. But at least with the PS4 and the Xbox One, you paid whatever you paid for it, but that was all you had to put into it, besides the pay-online bullshit, which is the reason why I kind of left console gaming over the past few years, because it's just, console gaming in general is a scam, but the Switch is even more of a scam than the PS4 and Xbox One, because at least you don't have to buy a separate controller in order to enjoy the PS4. Because I'm sorry, but the Switch controller with the Joy-Cons into that controller, like the controller that comes with the Switch, it's dog shit. It plays like shit, doesn't feel good, it's terrible. So almost everyone I know has to buy the Switch Pro controller, because, I mean, if you try to play a game like Overwatch with the Joy-Cons, or most games really, even Splatoon, you're going to be at a disadvantage, like a significant disadvantage, because of how cramped that controller feels. So it's almost mandatory if you own a Switch to buy a Pro controller, so that's at least $50. It hardly comes with enough memory to hold the games that you want to play, so you're going to have to buy an SD card that will run you anywhere between $30 and $100 depending on how much storage you want, but that's still almost $100 more than the system actually costs. So that just feels like a ripoff, especially when their last handheld, the 3DS, the SD card that came with it, you didn't ever have to worry about storage. You didn't have to worry about getting a bigger SD card unless you took a lot of photos, but who takes photos on a 3DS, right? No, but like the actual storage was in the games themselves. The SD card, was extra shit, but you didn't really need to have, to buy an external SD card for a lot of money. But you do on the Switch, even though the Switch still uses the cartridge system, which drives up the cost of games exponentially because the SD card, or not the SD card, the cartridge, the game cartridge, is more expensive to manufacture than a Blu-ray disc, while there is zero benefit to it because the cartridge can't keep up with modern gaming and the amount of storage that games have these days. So that's another thing that makes the Switch automatically worse than the 3DS, because at least with the 3DS, games fit on the cartridge. You didn't need to install shit onto an external drive or nothing like that. Everything worked right out the box on the 3DS, but with the Switch, that's not the case. You have to buy more shit for it. You have so many hidden costs with the Switch that were not existent with the 3DS. Running out of storage space was never an issue on the 3DS, but with the Switch, there are literally games like NBA 2K where a 32GB card that comes with the fucking Switch is not enough. You have to buy more just to run one game. So that's yet another reason why the Switch is automatically worse than the 3DS, because the 3DS didn't have that problem. And then don't get me started with the paid online, the $20 a year. That's not worth shit because Nintendo has no online infrastructure. They're still living in 1992. In order to do voice chat, you have to download an app on your phone. What if someone calls you on the phone? Like, why are you paying for an online service? There's no fucking service. So that's a big problem. The Joy-Con drift is another one. The Switch just has so many issues that it can't even be in the conversation as the best console, never mind the best handheld from Nintendo. Especially as a handheld, because a handheld that's not portable, a handheld that's less portable than every other Nintendo handheld that's come before. I understand the whole hybrid thing, but come on. If we're judging it just as a handheld, it can't win. It can't be even close to being the best. The build quality for the Switch is the worst we've ever seen from Nintendo. I don't remember any Nintendo system having as much issues as the Switch is right now with the Joy-Con drift. And of course, we have the consoles like the PS4 and the Xbox One that have issues with the analog sticks, especially the PS4. I had a lot of drifting problems with the DualShock 4, but the difference is you can buy a different controller and your situation will be better. And of course, with the regular Switch, you can just buy different Joy-Cons. But when we're talking about the Switch Pro, or not the Switch Pro, the Switch Lite, that's not an option because the Joy-Con's literally built into the system. And I get it, I'm in the minority. I know the Switch is a huge success. It's one of the biggest success stories from Nintendo. It's probably going to be the most successful platform that Nintendo has ever put out. It's probably going to outsell the Wii at the end of the day because the Switch has about 2 more years of life in its time. So it's going to be around 2023 when we get a new system from Nintendo. I think in that 2-year time period, it's very possible that the Switch is on pace to outsell the Wii and the PlayStation 4 even. We'll see, but it's very possible. So just so I make myself clear before I finish this video, I'm not trying to say the Switch is a terrible system overall. This video was mainly meant to judge the Switch just as a handheld, because I know it's a hybrid system, so it's kind of its own thing. It's not necessarily a 3DS, but it's also not a Wii or a Wii U. It's kind of a combination of those two platforms. I get it, but as someone who's been playing on handhelds for most of my life, the Switch is a big disappointment because I'm used to being able to have a handheld to carry it around anywhere I want, to just stick it in my pocket, and also have a decent battery life out of it. The Switch doesn't have either of those things, whether we're talking about the original model or the Switch Lite. And of course, the later model has a better battery life, but the portability thing is the big thing when we're talking about a handheld, and none of the Switch platforms have that at all, and I think that's a huge problem. To think that back in 1992, people were laughing at the Sega Game Gear for being too big and the fact that it couldn't fit in your pocket. Now these days, that's the standard in handheld gaming. It's ridiculous. But 48% of you think that the Switch is the greatest Nintendo handheld of all time. I guess we're gonna have to agree to disagree, because I have no idea how anybody can reasonably come to that conclusion. Unless you're like 10 years old and don't know any other system Nintendo has had before, I guess. But as someone who has played Nintendo handheld since 2002, the Switch is definitely the worst.